Hey guys, so I'm here in Grand Teton National Park, and I'm on what's called Mormon Row. You come up to almost Moose Junction, the park visitor center I took you to last year is right over there, and the park's spread out that way and this way. But just off the road is this park attraction called Mormon Row. And back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a bunch of Mormon settlers came over this way from Idaho, I believe, and they settled along here and started farming all this pasture land out here, what would be pasture land, because it had good fertile soil and the Gravant River and lots of creeks and streams and so forth. And so there's old original buildings and structures. Sorry, my nose is running. It's kind of a cool morning after it's been so hot this summer. And so you can walk and visit these structures. I think most of them have been turned over to the park by the families, although there's one private one down the lane that I'll show you. They're called Molten Cabins, and they rent them out. You can get online and rent cabins there. But these structures are pretty interesting because they homesteaded here. The interesting thing about this row is they didn't have electricity out here till like the 1950s. One of the homesteads has a windmill that they used for some electricity for a little while. But so they were out here for 50 years or so, farming and living without the modern conveniences of electricity, and I don't think they had running water for several decades, and so it's pretty rough living out here, and the fact that they were able to do it is kind of interesting. They're unique in that they settled together along this row for a better sense of community, as the sign will tell you over there, and just kind of a cohesiveness to have some neighbors and people to go to church with and maybe school with and stuff like that. So instead of just having these scattered, isolated ranches. But it's really pretty out here, and I hope you enjoy the visit to these different sites. Here's some of the original cabins. Most of the structures are all boarded up, so they don't use them anymore. They're just for you to visit and see. And a lot of them started out as kind of primitive structures, and then they started adding things, better windows or brick chimneys or some electricity here and there. There's an old outhouse, kind of the most scenic outhouse in the world, right there at the base of the Tetons. There's an old original cabin out there. Along with the molten barn, which I'll show you over there back down the row. This is one of the famous original barns here. And then this was a structure that they built. They moved out of the cabins and built this. I think it's a stick frame with stucco on the outside, and it was kind of a nicer home for Mormon Row at the time. It had kind of a more permanent feel to it, and it was probably the nicest structure on the row, I guess, as they might consider it. But aren't too many stucco buildings from that time period out here. Most everything was wood built with some stone, but even today there's not a lot of stucco buildings out here in the mountainous western Wyoming. There's a homestead out there at the end of the row, still standing. Kind of be a beautiful place to have a ranch house, wouldn't it? All your cows out in the pastures out there, your farm fields out that way. And every day get up and walk into your yard and see the Tetons. This is the Andrew and Ida Chambers homestead. This has the most buildings on it. Looks like some of them have been restored a bit. Others have a lot of the original barn and hay sheds and a little cabin back in there, it looks like. Might have been one of the originals. A lot of these kind of were added to over the decades in the 1900s as the family grew or the operation changed hands. And so those of you that live on ranches, you might have barns and sheds like this that you're like, that's not that big a deal, but these people came up here in the pretty tough country. Like I said, there was no electricity to this area until the 1950s or so, I think. And so it was pretty rustic living in these cabins and barns and rustic farming. And there's some of the original cabins there. Pretty place to live. Not many neighbors. And then right across your lane are the Grand Tetons. The Gravant River flows down through there. Snake River off behind me, back through there. But they use the Gravant River and some other streams and tributaries, from what I understand, to farm a lot of this. Couldn't tell if that was a long rolling thunderstorm or some kind of equipment over there. Oh, it was a jet plane flying out of the airport back over in Moose. Anyway, they created a series of ditches and dikes and irrigation canals all through here. And so they brought water in and farmed all this, and it was really fertile soil. So they were very successful with it. Well, successful on their terms, but and then unique to the area, instead of having really scattered ranches, these group of Mormon settlers who came up, I think over from Idaho, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, settled kind of a row of homes here, so they'd kind of have a little bit of community and neighbors and so forth. So anyway, they give you a little history of it here. Most of the families have turned their land over to the national park, and so it's become kind of an attraction within the park. But there's a few that are holding on to private residences here and there and using them just for family vacations, or they rent them out to people that want to come stay here. Some sunlight on the Tetons. It's a pretty park. It's so quiet up here. There's a jet plane flying into Moran. Kind of a bummer they put that airport in there, and throughout the day you have to see these jet planes flying right over this beautiful quiet valley all the time, right in your view. So here on this Mormon Row is what they call it here in Grand Teton Park. This is the Thomas Perry homestead, and I think he built this in the early 1900s and then ranched out of this location here at the end of the row, at least what's left of the row. The Tetons are there behind the trees. You can't really see them. The main peaks are right there. from what I understand, they didn't have electricity out here until like the mid 1940s, I think. I think they used this windmill for electricity before, I think it was the 40s or 50s that they finally brought power out to this row of cabins and homes. But this was what's left of the homestead here. Old building, everything's boarded up, and looks like the buildings aren't in that great a shape. But so this is the Molten Cabins. This is another part of the homestead. You can see the Tetons behind, and they do private rentals here. They do private rentals here. There's some of the, I think there's a few original outbuildings, and then some restored stuff, and then the old family home. But they decided to turn this, instead of turning it over to the park as an attraction, they decided to turn it into kind of a family business of sorts. And so there's the sign on the house, Molten Cabins. But you can rent guest lodges here, and they have a website. It's on the sign here. There it is. Right there. So you can go on that website and rent their cabins. Kind of a cool location for a house though. And there's the Tetons and the views of the back porch. So one of the more famous attractions or sites to photograph is this molten barn. It's the old, I think it's the original structure here. It was built in the early 1900s, over several decades as I understand it. And people like to photograph the barn with the Tetons in the back. And it's kind of a world famous photographer's site. So it's kind of cool, and it's right here on this Mormon row. It's a park attraction here. Looks like we got some marmots or something burrowing in these holes. Anyway, here's the, oh, there's one right there. Prairie dogs. Must be. But here's the famous barn with the Tetons in the back. It'd be a beautiful spot to have a barn, huh? Well, after visiting Mormon Row, I drove out here to the north end of the park because I'm headed that way anyway, hoping the buffalo herds would be out here, but they're not here, so they must have pulled back. Anyway, it's kind of smoky and hazy from all the forest fires in Utah and California, so it's hard to see the Tetons, but hopefully you enjoyed that trip to Teton Park to see Mormon Row. As much as I've driven past it, probably 30 or 40 times in the last couple of years, I've never stopped and visited it myself, so I thought it might be interesting. So thanks for coming on this field trip, and hope you enjoyed it. See you guys.